Welcome to episode 3 of Witness Titanic, part 2 of our questioning of Mr. Bruce Ismay, managing director of the White Star Line. Last episode, we heard Bruce describe the conception of Titanic, her safety features, his insistence that he was a passenger only and had no hand in the navigation of Titanic. And we even heard in his own words how he was given an iceberg warning by Captain Smith and he carried it around for a few hours in his pocket. Funny thing for a passenger to do. Today, we join Bruce once more aboard Titanic on April 14th, 1912. We hear about the collision with the iceberg, the boarding of lifeboats, the rescue operation, and so much more, all in his own words. All right, we've made it. We made it to the big moment, the iceberg collision and sinking. What was Bruce Ismay's experience? So when asked about the iceberg collision, he describes it this way, quote, "I was in bed myself, asleep, when the accident happened. I presume the impact awakened me." He continues to say, "Eventually I got up and walked along the passageway and met one of the stewards and said, 'What has happened?' He said, 'I do not know, sir.' I then went back into my room, put my coat on, and went up on the bridge where I found Captain Smith. I asked him what had happened, and he said, 'We have struck ice.' I said, 'Do you think the ship is seriously damaged?' He said, 'I'm afraid she is.' I then went down below, I think it was, where I met Mr. Bell, the chief engineer, who was in the main companionway. I asked if he thought the ship was seriously damaged, and he said he thought she was, but was quite satisfied the pumps would keep her afloat. I think I went back onto the bridge. I heard the order given to get the boats out." So this is very valuable and interesting information. Here's why. So Titanic enthusiasts, particularly those of us who love survivor testimony, we enjoy a good puzzle. Every answer in these inquiries or every letter or memoir written by a survivor contains these little clues. And what we like to do in our free time is compare these clues against each other to try to piece together a timeline. It's like trying to solve a crime based on nothing. It's really, really interesting. So as we talk through various survivors' experiences on this and future episodes, keep an ear out for those clues. Do they mention a time when they think a certain event occurred? Do they see a fellow survivor on deck whose testimony we can cross-reference to see when they thought this happened? Or, more likely, for no explained reason, do they skip an entire hour of the sinking? When something happened at 1:15 a.m., did they actually mean 1:12 a.m. and they were rounding up, or did they mean 1:18 and they were rounding down? Because that's a big range. That's 6 whole minutes that it could have taken place. It's just the ultimate puzzle. 2,208 stories took place on this night. Only 712 had the opportunity to be told, and far less were ever actually told, let alone written down for us 112 years later. So we have to look very closely at what we do have. So Ismay says he was in bed when the accident happened. So we know this to be around 11:40 p.m. We know this because of an overwhelming amount of testimony and evidence and research points to 11:40 p.m. That is the accepted time of the iceberg elision. Then he says eventually he got up and talked to a steward. Unfortunately, he does not name the steward or say how long eventually is. But I don't know. I wouldn't put that longer than 5 to 10 minutes. I think if I woke up in bed and laid there for 15 to 20 minutes, I would acknowledge that. But, we really have no clue. We don't know. Eventually it could be anything. Then he gets dressed and goes up to the bridge to find Captain Smith. And that whole activity couldn't have taken longer than 10 to 15 minutes. So we can assume that this conversation between managing director and captain took place around midnight is a good guess. Do other survivors see Ismay as he walks to the bridge? And if they do they specify what time it is? Probably not. So we really don't know. But perhaps the most informative clue that we get from this testimony that I just read comes in that conversation between Bruce and Captain Smith. Bruce asks, "Do you think the ship is seriously damaged?" And Smith's response is, "I'm afraid she is." So the Titanic enthusiasts among us would say, okay, this conversation must have happened closer to 12:30 or later, because we know from our research and we know from survivor testimony, I believe specifically Fourth Officer Boxhall, we know that Thomas Andrews was the one who delivered the news to Captain Smith that it was extremely serious and that the ship was going to sink. But that didn't happen until around 12:25, 12:30. So if he's saying it's serious, then this conversation must have taken place much later than Ismay seems to suggest, unless when he said eventually, he literally meant 20, 30, 40 minutes. Could Ismay really have taken 45 minutes to wake up, question a steward, change, and then climb 2 decks to the bridge? How does that line up? But one thing I'd like to point out about this moment, when you ask Captain Smith whether the ship was seriously damaged, and he says, "I'm afraid she is," it's all relative, isn't it? You know, what is seriously damaged when you don't think that anything is wrong? I mean, if you think about it, the iceberg scraped the starboard side of the hull. And when Titanic arrives in New York in a few days, what part of the ship is going to pass by Manhattan on their grand entrance to New York Harbor? It's going to be the starboard side of the ship. So in their mind, seriously damaged could just mean an embarrassing arrival in New York with paint scraped along the side. We may have to delay our voyage for a couple of hours while we figure out where the damage is. Passengers will be, so slightly inconvenienced. Little do they know, in a few minutes from Thomas Andrews, they're going to hear how absolutely serious this situation really is. So this conversation is a big clue as to the movements of these two men, but we may need more info. Bruce carries on with his testimony, mentioning a conversation with Joseph Bell, who does not survive, so sadly there's no way to cross-reference there. And then he returns to the bridge to hear the order given to get the boats out. Now, this is something many would have heard, and enough do hear this order, and enough survivors see the order carried out, that we can actually place this order given at about 12:12, at least 10 minutes before Andrews delivers the bad news. So this order is given out preemptively before Smith knows all the details. But that means we can officially place the original Ismay-Smith conversation too much earlier, to between 11:45 and around midnight-ish, which fits Bruce's use of the word eventually. So this is sort of the fun game that we get to play. We go back and forth between thinking one person's testimony is the solution to all of our mysteries, and then someone else brings up a different testimony, and it just throws it all out the window. But now we get to a pretty unique part of Bruce's testimony, because most survivors, when they recount the events to the Senate or in a memoir or a letter, they remember very clearly the accident, being woken up, talking to a steward, waking their family, going on deck to just see what happened, the immediate aftermath of the iceberg collision. They remember that clearly. And then the next thing they talk about is boarding a lifeboat, which in many cases happens an hour or two later. There's just a massive gap in between. And that's because what happens in between is just a lot of waiting around, a lot of talking with your friends, going to the purser's office to collect your things maybe, but it's just uneventful. And so there's no memories there. Unfortunately for our timeline, there's just these hours of missing information where we want to know what these survivors did, because we're trying to piece this puzzle together. Bruce, thankfully, does say in one quick sentence what he was doing from the 12:12 a.m. order of getting the boats out to when he leaves the ship almost 2 hours later. I assisted as best I could getting the boats out and putting the women and children into the boats. I stood upon that deck practically until I left the ship in the starboard collapsible boat. Small aside for those less familiar, a little Lifeboats 101. Titanic had 20 lifeboats. In the simplest terms possible, 16 of them were fully wooden boats. 2 of them were emergency boats, so they were a little smaller, but essentially 16 were, we'll just call them full-sized, proper lifeboats. Most of these held about 65 people in perfect conditions, calm water. 65 people is their capacity. These boats were numbered 1 through 16. The other 4 boats, the remaining 4, were called collapsible boats. They had a wooden bottom that was buoyant on its own and canvas sides. These canvas sides could collapse, hence the name collapsible boats. They could collapse for storing purposes. You could store many more collapsible boats on a deck than you could a rigid wooden boat. Now, these 4 collapsibles were lettered A through D, A, B, C, D, and could hold around 47 people in, again, ideal conditions. They would also be the last 4 boats to leave the ship. The first of these will be collapsible lifeboat C, and that is the lifeboat that Bruce Ismay will board. But after 112 years of research done by people far more knowledgeable of Titanic than myself, we can confidently say that this moment that Bruce is about to describe, the most consequential moment in his life, took place at 2 a.m. when Titanic has but 20 minutes left on the surface. Ismay explains. The boat was there. There was a certain number of men in the boat, and the officer called out asking if there were any more women, and there was no response, and there were no passengers left on the deck. And as the boat was in the act of being lowered away, I got into it. And with that, I got into it. Just 4 words. Ismay's life is just ruined. And it's just so absolutely unnecessarily tragic. He's asked by a senator on day 11, why did you enter it? And Ismay answers, because there was room in the boat. She was being lowered away. I felt the ship was going down, and I got into the boat. He asks further, do you know how many people were in it? Ismay says, I should think there were about 40 women in it and some children. There was a child in arms. I think they were all third-class passengers, so far as I could see. And he's even asked what he was wearing in the lifeboat, which is an interesting question. Not everybody gets asked this. But because of this quote, most of the films of Titanic show Ismay in a similar sort of dress. He says, I had a suit of pajamas on, a pair of slippers, a suit of clothes, and an overcoat. Now, you may be asking yourself why Bruce claims there were no passengers on deck at this late stage of the sinking. If 1,496 people are about to lose their lives, surely they are on deck. Certainly, Bruce must be lying. He must be trying to make himself look good that he didn't push anyone out of the way to take the spot. There was no one on deck. There was no one else. I was the only one who could have taken the spot. But research does back up what Bruce is saying. It's something we will touch on much more with someone like Second Officer Lightholler, but yes, pretty much every lifeboat that was launched experiences issues with finding willing passengers to board them. Whether the deck was filled with passengers who literally would not board out of fear, or like in this situation where passengers weren't even on deck, weren't even visible. Why they would not board, why they weren't around when these boats were being loaded is a topic for a future episode. Next, Bruce describes what it was like to be in the lifeboat as it was lowered, which you have to remember would be one of the most terrifying things anybody had gone through to that point in their life, especially a first-class passenger, potentially a more sheltered life. You're being lowered off the side of a ship down multiple stories into icy black water in the middle of the night. And the boat is being lowered by a couple sailors with rope. There's no machine lowering this lifeboat. It's being lowered by hand. Let's remember that. And there's sometimes 65 or so people in the boat. Absolutely terrifying. But this is how Bruce describes it. The ship had quite a list to port. Consequently, this canvas boat, this collapsible boat, was getting hung up on the outside of the ship, and she had to rub right along her. And we had to try and shove her out. And we had to get the women to help to shove to get her clear of the ship. So what he is describing is sort of the number one issue with lifeboats, and it's still an issue to this day if you're ever unfortunate enough to board a lifeboat on a cruise ship, for example. If a ship is listing, for those who don't know, that's sort of leaning from left to right, listing from port to starboard. This is something they do often. If they're sinking, ships aren't meant to sink, and when they do, they often list, and if they list enough, they'll capsize. It becomes very difficult when a ship is listing to lower lifeboats, because if you're on the top side of the ship, on the side, the opposite that it's leaning, you can't drop a lifeboat because it needs to drop to the water, but now the ship is literally in the way. And it's not great for the other side either. If you're on the bottom of the ship as it's leaning towards your side, your boat is now swinging way far out, and now you can't even board the boat. So what he is describing is what a lot of Titanic passengers go through. Basically, if you're on the wrong side of the ship at the wrong time, and the list is not in your favor, you have to literally use your hands to push against the rivets of Titanic to push your boat away from it so it can lower. So it's not safe. It's not comforting, especially if your boat is literally made of canvas. I assume that makes it even more precarious. So this was not an enjoyable launching of collapsible lifeboat C. So now Bruce is in the lifeboat, it's in the water, and they are pulling away from the ship. And so the senators ask, did you see the ship after you left her in the collapsible boat? Ismay says, I saw her once. They ask, what was her position then? Ismay says, she was very much down by the head. Her starboard light was just about level with the water. Now, in simple terms, that basically means the bridge was at water level. So this is, again, very late in the sinking. This is 20 minutes to go, maybe less now because it took 5 or so minutes for them to drop to the water. He's asked, did the ship break in two so far as you could see? And Ismay says, I never looked around again. Which leads us to a particularly harsh back and forth between Senator Smith and Ismay, and I'll read it in full. I'll just hop back and forth between them. Really, really hard to imagine Ismay recounting this. It starts with Senator Smith. Can you describe the manner in which she went down? I did not see her go down. You did not see her go down? No, sir. How far were you from the ship? I do not know how far we were away. I was sitting with my back to the ship. I was rowing all the time I was in the boat. We were pulling away. You were rowing? Yes, I did not wish to see her go down. You did not care to see her go down? No. I am glad I did not. So hard to imagine that this man could not even look at the ship as it sank. And as we'll see in a minute aboard Carpathia, he's going to very quickly begin to deal with some pretty severe PTSD, and a lot of survivors will. But Ismay wrote something later in life that I'd like to read. It's not from the inquiry, so I'm sort of breaking the rules for a second. But he wrote this later in life, and it really lets you in to his brain a little bit. And I'd like to share it with you so we can understand Ismay the human being a little bit more. The doctor tells me the strain I have been through has affected my heart, and it will be a long time until it recovers. Any ambitions I had are entirely gone, and my life's work is ruined. I never want to see a ship again, and I loved them so. Though Bruce has very little to say about Titanic's final moments, I think that says plenty. Now, unfortunately for Bruce, his night is not over. We now board the Carpathia. When I got on board the ship, I stood with my back against the bulkhead, and somebody came up to me and said, "Will you not go into the saloon and get some soup or something to drink?" "No," I said, "I really do not want anything at all." He said, "Do go and get something." I said, "No, if you will leave me alone, I will be much happier here." I said, if you will get me in some room where I can be quiet, I wish you would. He said, please go in the saloon and get something hot. I said I would rather not. Then he took me and put me into a room. I did not know whose the room was at all. This man proved to be the doctor of the Carpathia. I was in that room until I left the ship. I was never outside the door of that room. During the whole of the time I was in this room, I never had anything of a solid nature at all. I lived on soup. I did not want very much of anything. Mr. Jack Thayer was brought into the room the morning we got on board the Carpathia. He stayed in the room for some little time, and the doctor came in after he had been in, I should think about a quarter of an hour, and he said to this young boy, would you not like something to eat? He said, I would like some bacon and eggs, which he had. I love that quote. What a story. So this would add to Ismay's negative view by most, that not only did he survive the sinking, assumably by pushing women out of the way, but he boarded the Carpathia and immediately got his own room, and he was never seen for the rest of the voyage. He just never left the room. Now, let's try to remember the trauma that he is going through, like everyone else. And I'm not saying he should get his own room, but he is a human being, and he's likely laying in that bed in that room in just complete silence, staring at the ceiling. Just to comprehend that sinking and to think that you had anything possibly to do with it by being the owner of the ship. I don't blame. I mean, I think I'm making my opinions of Ismay quite clear. I do not blame him for really anything that he does in this story. But I do love the little bit about young Jack Thayer getting some bacon and eggs. It just humanizes these people a little bit, that's what he wanted. And that's what I always want, all the time. At some point, Captain Rostron of the Carpathia urged Bruce Ismay to send a message to New York telling them of the incident, which he did. And in fact, I have here, these were all presented in the testimony. Ismay read them aloud on his 11th day of the testimony. All the messages that were sent and received between him and New York. So it lets us in on a really interesting back and forth between them. So the first message was sent on April 15th, and it apparently wasn't received for 2 whole days. So for 2 days, everybody at the White Star Line office, and including everyone in Ismay's family, are just hearing the news from the newspapers like anyone else. But he sent this message on April 15th. This is the first official word to land about what happened. Ismay wrote, deeply regret advise you Titanic sank this morning after collision iceberg, resulting serious loss life. Full particulars later. Bruce Ismay. One of the most famous messages ever sent, ever. Incredible. Later on, he says this presumably was received on the 17th as well. He wrote, very important you should hold Cedric daylight Friday for Titanic's crew. Answer. And then he signs this one Yamsey, which is sort of his like code name. It's Ismay backwards. In a time where anybody could overhear your messages, wireless telegraphy, you're just listening to dots and dashes. Anyone can hear them. So to maybe not sign your name Ismay might be smart, but this would, of course, add to the secretiveness. Maybe he's trying to trick somebody, get out of trouble by saying Yamsey. It's all very stupid. But he's saying, hold Cedric, which is another White Star ship, hold them for Friday night, for Daylight Friday for Titanic's crew. As Ismay makes it very clear here in a second, he wants every member of Titanic's crew to get back home immediately, himself included. So the next message worth bringing up here was sent on April 17th at 3:30 p.m. to the Carpathia. So this is like right after they get these messages that were apparently held up for a couple days. This comes from Ismay's wife. She writes to Bruce, so thankful you are saved, but grieving with you over terrible calamity. Shall sail Saturday to return with you, Florence. Gosh, can you imagine? Your husband is safe, thank God, but you know the hell that is to come for both of you. But also, Bruce, to hear from your wife, I can't imagine. Philip Franklin, who is he sort of runs the White Star Line offices in New York. So he's kind of the main communication here. He also says, "Accept my deepest sympathy. Horrible catastrophe. Will meet you aboard Carpathia after docking. Is Widener aboard? Franklin." Bruce would go into more detail now that he has received messages and no one has answered what he said. Answer, please. He literally wrote answer. So he says again, "Most desirable. Titanic crew aboard Carpathia should be returned home earliest moment possible. Suggest you hold Cedric, sailing her daylight Friday, unless you see any reason contrary. Propose returning in her myself. Please send outfit of clothes, including shoes, for me to Cedric. Have nothing of my own. Please reply." He finally gets a response from Philip Franklin. He says, "Have arranged forward crew Lapland sailing Saturday, calling Plymouth. We all consider most unwise delay Cedric considering all circumstances." Bruce goes on to say, "Please join Carpathia at quarantine if possible." He sends another message, again repeating, "Very important. You should hold Cedric daylight Friday for Titanic crew. Reply." And then he says again, "Think most unwise. Keep Titanic crew until Sunday. Strongly urge detain Cedric, sailing her midnight if desirable." Then he says another message, "Unless you have good and sufficient reason for not holding Cedric, please arrange do so. Most undesirable have crew New York so long." I love the truncated way to reading these out loud is just very funny. This is his last message from Carpathia. "Widener not aboard. Hope see you quarantine. Please cable wife am returning Cedric." So he's just like, all right, you haven't said anything. So Cedric, I'm going on the Cedric. He's just insistent on going home. And Senator Smith brings up that this is a bit suspicious. He says, "Judging from the messages, it was your intention to return the night you landed, if possible, to Liverpool." And Ismay says, "Yes, sir. At that time, you understand, I had not the slightest idea there was going to be any investigation of this sort." And so Ismay arrives in New York, and in 13 or less hours, he will be answering the first questions of the very first inquiry. But what's interesting is apparently throughout the events from arrival, meeting William Alden Smith on Carpathia, and throughout the 11 days that he is kept in New York, he keeps asking William Alden Smith and his subcommittee to please let him go home. And again, I can't help but feel for the guy. I would want to go home too. And especially because he isn't really asked any questions on days 2 through 10. So I don't know what he was needed for. Of course, they do ask him a lot of these questions on day 11, and then they do let him go. But William Alden Smith does something a little, snarky, I suppose. He reads a letter that Ismay sent him, and then reads the letter that he sent back to Ismay. Basically, Ismay gives a big plea, and it's a really well-written letter, and it's very sweet. He just wants to go home. Like he says, "Look, I've been super helpful for you, and I'll come back as soon as you need me. I will make every expert available to you. I'll give you all of our records. I'll give you everything. Please let me go home." And this is what William says back. This is part of what Senator Smith says back. Quote, "As I said to you in New York on Friday evening last, when you asked to be permitted to return home, and again on Saturday night when you made the same request, I shall not consent to your leaving this country until the fullest inquiry has been made into the circumstances surrounding the accident. This information can be fully detailed by yourself and other officers of your company and the officers and crew of your ship. I am working night and day to achieve this result, and you should continue to help me instead of annoying me and delaying my work by your personal importunities." Love it. A little male-based bickering between Ismay and Smith. So they make him stay. Thankfully, at the end of day 11, they let him go home. And our last quote, I just find so fascinating. There's really no category for it. I didn't know where to put it, so I saved it for the end. At one point on his day 1 testimony, he says, quote, "I had never seen an iceberg in my life before." And I think that is just fascinating, for your entire life to be changed forever by something you'd never seen, never thought you'd see. And that goes for a lot of Titanic's passengers and crew. There's a lot of crew who had never seen an iceberg until the iceberg. Before we go, I've been saying I would share my thoughts on Bruce, and my thoughts are these. Bruce Ismay is described by some as the most misunderstood person in the 20th century. If you read about him, read his stories and like the Ismay line, for example, sort of the biography of the whole family. He's described as quiet. He's described as hard to get along with at first. He has walls up, basically. And you can even read about how his father treated him and potentially where those walls came from. Ismay could do with some therapy, I think, pre-Titanic even. He has trouble getting to know people. But once you get to know him, you become very close with him and he becomes a close friend. I think we all know someone like that, and I think potentially many of you listening are someone like that. I personally think that I'm that way. My wife often has to tell me when we go to like a party where I'm going to meet some of her friends or whatever, she has to remind me, smile, like be nice. It's not that I'm not nice. I just, we all have our walls up at times. And I think Bruce was that way. And so here he is being shown in our media, in our movies, in our stories as this awful villain, very charismatic and demanding villain, whether it's the 1997 film, Night to Remember, Titanic the musical, he's the villain, he's the antagonist in all of them. There's no evidence to say that he truly pushed Captain Smith to go faster. And if anything, there's way more evidence to say that he wouldn't dream of taking that step with Captain Smith to say he knows that's not his place. I don't find it in his character to tell Captain Smith what to do. It's literally against the laws of the sea. So I certainly don't blame him for any sort of speed issues. And also look at the speed. They weren't trying to break records. So like, even if he was telling Captain Smith to do those things, it's clear that he wasn't. So, not all of the boilers were lit, as Ismay tells us. So I certainly don't blame him for that. But when you get to the sinking, he is seen by many people loading lifeboats, getting women and children into the boats, getting them out. Very respectable behavior while the ship is sinking. And then we get to the one time where you can sort of debate is whether or not he should have gotten in that lifeboat. On one hand, he is a passenger. He deserves to be saved if he wants to be saved. There were empty seats. Why not? And on the other hand, he was the owner of the ship. He was basically a member of the crew. He should have gone down with the ship, much like the captain would. We know captains go down with ships. Why don't managing directors go down with ships? For me, I don't think anyone should ever have to do anything in regards to losing their life. Titanic is filled with a story filled with death, particularly amongst the men who know it is their job to stay behind. So many men lost their lives because of the weird toxic masculinity of 1912. So many women lost their husbands out of stubbornness. I will be the first to tell you, I wouldn't have even waited for collapsible sea. I would have gotten in the very first lifeboat that I could. Thank you very much. So long as, of course, I'm not pushing anyone else away. If the lifeboat is going half empty, let me in. Bruce got in the lifeboat. He has a family at home. I don't blame him for a damn thing in regards to boarding collapsible sea. And my last point about Bruce is this. If you are a Titanic enthusiast, or if you are or if you like this podcast, you have to be grateful that Bruce chose the cowardly route of boarding collapsible sea. Can you imagine what limited idea we would have of the Titanic disaster if he did not survive? All this information that I just read to you would be gone. There are so many things that Bruce saw that no one else saw, that Bruce experienced that no one else experienced. I mean, the interactions with Thomas Andrews and Captain Smith that only he was present for. There's so many things that if we didn't have Bruce's testimony, we would be more in the dark than we already are. And there's already so many stories we'll never hear. Why not? Why add one more? So I happily tell you that Bruce Ismay did the right thing. He boarded that lifeboat, and I would have as well. And he was not the villain. He did not push the ship to go faster. He did not cower away. He did everything in his absolute best. But because society is the way that it is, we need a villain. And Bruce is that villain, very much, unfortunately. So moving forward in your daily life, if Bruce Ismay ever comes up in conversation, or if you see something clickbaity about Bruce Ismay being a coward, don't click on it. Don't listen to it. And tell people the real story of Bruce Ismay, that he waited until the last moments of the sinking to finally step into a lifeboat. And he only did it because why waste another life when we just don't have to? And with that, the witness withdrew. Folks, I am so glad that you joined me for these first 3 episodes. If there is something I believe, it is that the life and loss of Titanic is the most interesting story of all time, and your willingness to listen to this podcast is proof of that. I hope that every episode you feel closer to Titanic and those that sailed aboard her. I know I do, just by recording them. And most of all, I hope we get a little closer to understanding what really happened 112 years ago. Our theme music is Song d'Automne by Archibald Joyce, often thought to be the final song played by Titanic's orchestra during the sinking. This recording in particular is by Ege Erdogan. Links to his things are in descriptions of things. And a big thanks to the Titanic Inquiry Project. Titanic Inquiry Project is a website that you can go to right now, and the entire testimony is there. A group of dedicated Titanic people spent God knows how long transcribing the testimony so we can read it online, and it is through those transcriptions that I'm able to do what I do here. So big thanks to them. Go check out their website. And folks, if you have Titanic questions for me, if you have Titanic corrections for me, email me, witnesstitanic@gmail.com, and maybe I'll discuss your thoughts on a future episode. Thanks again for listening. We will reconvene in episode 4 to continue our fascinating investigation into the loss of Titanic.